But in case you have not caught any of this series, or you're not familiar with the book of James, which is totally fine, or you haven't been listening on it, at home, or any of that kind of stuff, let me just quickly bring you up to speed. Basically, this guy named James, who's the little brother of Jesus, literally, biologically speaking, he was the younger brother of Jesus. He wrote this letter to Jewish people who had become Christians back in the first century and were dispersed to other parts of the known world because they were abused, oppressed, just kind of kicked out. They weren't looked upon as, normal citizens, and just no one wanted anything to do with them. And so he wrote this letter specifically to them, but really it's applicable to anyone who is looking into faith, anyone who wants to follow Jesus, anyone who's made a commitment to Christ. Anywhere on the spiritual spectrum, if you want to take this stuff seriously, this whole Jesus thing and Christianity and all that, you want to take that seriously and grow in it, right? Move in the right direction in it. The book of James is for you. And the big idea that he keeps coming back to, and you've heard, if you've been part of this series, even just twice during the summer, you've heard me say this before, but it's so key because James is constantly going back to this. And it's really the whole idea of his letter. That when it comes to being a Christian, what you say doesn't prove who you are. What you do proves who you are. That's his big idea. Now, James isn't preaching some, hey, you know what, you've got to do enough good stuff to make God love you, to make God forgive you, to have the gift of Jesus Christ be available to you. It's not what he's saying at all. And there's been scholars and historians over the years that have struggled a little bit with the book of James because he is really focused on what you do now as a result of putting your faith into Jesus. But it's not a works thing. It's not a, hey, you know what, do enough good stuff to get God to like you, get God to love you. That's not the deal at all. The gift of salvation is just that. It's a gift. The Bible's so clear on it. Jesus was clear on it. Paul's clear on it. James would be clear on it if he was sitting down writing specifically about that. But you and I just have to say yes to him, to the free gift that he offers, to be forgiven, to be united with him for all eternity. It's all based on what he has done for us, not what we do. And we just say, I need it. I take that. I accept that into my life. So what James is saying is not in contrary to any of that, the truth of the gospel. But what he is saying, for those of us who've accepted that free gift of grace into our lives, it should change us. God's Spirit comes and lives inside of us, and something should start to happen where we walk out a life of faith that looks different from how we used to live. That's why we titled this series More Than Words. That ultimately, when it's all said and done, our faith, our relationship with Jesus, our Christianity is not based on ultimately what we say, because you and I can say whatever we want. I can check the box, I can fill out the form, I can do all the things and say, yeah, that's me, I'm a Christian. But ultimately, when it's all said and done, the evidence for that is going to be in what I do, not in what I say. So that's the big idea of what James keeps coming back to time and time again. All the topics he brings up, all the examples he brings up, it all points back to that one big idea. And today he's specifically looking at how do we, as those of us who are trying to follow Jesus and put our faith into action, as he is challenging us to do from the very first sentence in his letter, how do we do that when it comes to responding to the circumstances we find ourselves in? Specifically, how do we do that in responding to situations where people have mistreated us, where people have abused us, where people have done the wrong thing and we have suffered in some way or another as a result? Now, if you were here last week or you're familiar with the book of James at all, James starts out chapter 5. Again, we're just kind of towards the tail end now of his letter. He starts out chapter 5 talking directly to people who will go after money and wealth and stuff and possessions with such abandon that they are willing to hurt anyone that gets in their way. Anything they have to do to get a little bit more, to obtain more wealth. And James isn't against having money. He's not against having stuff. It's not an anti-rich message at all. But what he is saying, if you're so focused and driven by money and stuff in this life that you will literally kick people to the curb as you go after it. You will lie, cheat, and steal to get a little bit more of it. You'll go to the place where you'd even let someone be killed if it meant you getting a little bit more. And that was happening back in the day of James. All these wealthy landowners in Galilee and other parts of the known world at that time that was part of the Roman Empire, these wealthy Roman landowners, they didn't care about people. They just wanted more money. And they'd lie, they'd cheat, they'd defraud their workers. They'd do whatever they could to keep a little bit more, to get a little bit more. And James calls them on it. He says, if you fall into that camp, that's just evil. That's wrong. I mean, you just got to stop. You need to change. This is not good. And so that's what he's just got done addressing. And now he turns his attention to those of us, or back then, or even today, who have experienced some kind of pain, some kind of suffering from when other people do wrong. Now, again, the context is specifically when you've suffered because other people have just gone after wealth and money and sort of kicked you to the curb or kicked you as they went along kind of thing. But it's applicable, what James is going to say here, to whenever you're mistreated, to whenever you encounter something that hurts you, that abuses you, that an unkind word all the way to the most extreme of people physically hurting you and everything in between. What James is going to tell us here is just as applicable. Now, here's the warning, though. James gets in our face a little bit, again, for those of us who have been mistreated by others. And you'd be tempted to say, well, geez, yeah, I get it, James. Go after those meanies, those evil dudes who just stop at nothing to get more money and more wealth and do whatever they have to do to people on that journey. Yeah, you need to rail on them. But as you get into this next part of the letter, you kind of start to feel like he's getting in your face a little bit for being the one who's suffered because of something like that, some wrongdoing, some mistreatment. And it's tempting to be like, wait a second, why? And here's why. Just before we even look at what he says. James wants you and I to understand how important it is as followers of Jesus that we respond in the right way to mistreatment, to abuse, to pain. Because that will say just as much about where we're at in our faith, and it will do just as much in terms of good or harm in our own lives and the lives of others as being the person who made the decision to do the wrong in the first place. And again, at first you can be like, that sounds a little harsh, but I think you'll get there as we look at it. But James wants us to know it's so important, so critical how you actually respond. In fact, I don't know if you've ever heard this, maybe you've said it. I certainly believe it's true. That life really is more about how you respond to the circumstances you face than the circumstances themselves. Because unless you live on another planet, you are guaranteed to go through some pretty rough circumstances at some point in your life. To some degree, even if it's really tiny, you probably do every day, right? Because you're a human being and we live kind of in a messed up world. So that's just part of the reality. So you can't judge your life based on all your circumstances, but you can based on how you respond to them. And that's what James wants us to wrestle with this morning. So we're going to look at this next part of James chapter 5. And again, you got to keep in mind, he's just addressed this specific example of these wealthy landowners, people who are just go after money and stuff and possessions as their driving vision, as their driving hope in life, and they will do anything to anyone in order to get more. So that's what he's just been talking about. And then he says this, be patient then, brothers and sisters. In other words, those who have suffered as a result of the type of people I just talked about, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. I'm going to pause just for a moment there, because what he's talking about there is not just that someday Jesus literally is going to come back to earth, although that's what we're taught in the Bible, and it's certainly believe that's true. And that's part of it. Back then, they thought it was going to happen any day. Frankly, we should probably think that too. Jesus will come back any day. We don't know, right? So that's part of Christian theology, and it's good Christian theology. Jesus is going to return to this earth to make everything right. That's one of the founding tenets of the Christian faith. And that's part of what they're talking about here. But the bigger idea is not just that Jesus himself is going to come back someday. What James is getting at here is ultimately God is the judge. God ultimately makes things right. And he's saying when you've suffered, when you've come against something, boy, if you want to be the one to, well, it's up to me to make things right then. James is saying, time out. That's not how this thing, God is ultimately the judge. You need to be patient and wait for the Lord's coming. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. Here, James he's talking to the people that suffer, and he gets in our face a little bit. The judge is standing at the door. He gives us this stern warning, right? Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. It's just referring to all those people in the Old Testament that God said, I got a message that you need to deliver to the people of Israel. And there were lots of them. And he said, you know what? These guys suffered. These guys got mistreated. These guys got abused. You think you've got it bad? Try being an Old Testament prophet, he's telling them. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. Those who stuck with it, those even though they got mistreated, they kept going. You have heard of Job's perseverance, here's another example, and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. In other words, here's another example. Here's the prophets, but then also think of Job. Man, Job's a guy that suffered, and ultimately God was compassionate with him. He was merciful towards him. He cared what Job was going through. He didn't be like, oh, well, Job's suffering, he's going through a lot, who cares? I got other things to deal with. No, God cared. James is trying to remind them of that. Go to the last part there. And then above all, this is how James ends this section of his letter, my brothers and sisters, do not swear. Now this is going to be another one of those parts in James where you're a little tempted to be like, how does this relate? But we'll wrap it up here in a minute. I think you'll make the connection. Not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, and here again, he gets a little harsh with us, you will be condemned. Otherwise, you will be condemned. How we respond to the stuff that we face, how we respond to the circumstances we go through, most importantly, how we respond to mistreatment from others really matters. It says a lot about our faith, actually. And James wants you and I to know that if we want to put our faith into action, we got to wrestle with this. We have to think about this. In a word, James says to respond with patience. It's so natural for you and I to want to push back, to want to make things right, to want to get revenge, to want to have something, make things even, whatever. And James is saying, you need to learn, I need to learn, when we are mistreated in life, to pause, to stop, to take a breath, think before you act. That's really the ultimate message here. It's not a, hey, here's a 4-part system and, formula to deal with the people that do mean things to you. He just wants you and I to stop and think, what if we paused before we reacted to the mistreatment we receive from others? Because here's why, and this is the specifics he'll get into in just a moment as we kind of reflect on some of these verses. When we don't pause, when we say this is up to us to make things right, to get even, bad things happen. It's not going to go nearly as well as you saw it happen in some movie sometime, or what inside of you says it will happen. Or it's not a good way to go. In fact, this is the big idea that James is really getting at here, I think, in this section of his letter. That when it comes to dealing with mistreatment we receive from others, putting our faith in action often means choosing not to take action at all. Sometimes the way to put your faith into action as a follower of Jesus, when you get mistreated by someone else, regardless, big, small, somewhere in between, all kinds of examples I know, whatever it is, sometimes putting your faith in action is just not taking any action at all, is pausing and being patient for God. Because it's natural. It's common. It's our natural instinct to do the opposite, to fight back, to do something. I've got to take action here. I've been wronged. I've suffered. I've been abused. I was watching, just to give you an example of how innate this is, at least in me. I was watching my son, who's 9 years old, play with his buddy Henry one day. This was just this last week. And I overheard them talking about how fast they were. Have you ever heard your kids talk about things like that? It's so funny, right? And you got to love it as a parent. I'm so fast. Oh, you're fast? No, I'm really fast, It's just funny, right? So but it's cute and adorable, and so I'm kind of listening in on it. But then all of a sudden my son says to his friend, you know what? I'm faster than my dad. Seriously, every time we race now, I beat him. And I'm like, I'm just right there, Now, a mature man of my age would have thought, that's so cute, and let 9-year-old boys, they think they're faster than their old men, You know what the first thing I thought was? Kid, you know what you're talking about. I could still beat you. When I'm 55, I'll be able to beat you in a running race because I'm dad, right? And that's literally, I'm just being real with you, that's the first thing that came to my mind. All of a sudden, I'm watching this cute little scene and 2 boys talking about sports and how they love to run and all this kind of stuff, and I just immediately become reaction guy to my son. Ridiculous. More to the point, I think a little more relevant to where we all live in terms of that impulse to react. Last summer, my wife and I and our kids, we were in Disneyland for a couple days, right? Awesome, dream vacation, spent a couple days in Disneyland with your little kids. And one day we've been all day at the park, and we're going to one of these hotels we were staying at that's, like a mile away or a mile and a half away. So it's, it's a decent walk, and it's like 10 o'clock at night. And it's the happiest place on earth, right? So we're exhausted, but we're like, oh, this was so fun. The kids have just got big little smiles on their face, but we're kind of dragging them by their armpits kind of thing because they're totally worn out. Anyway, we're standing on this corner, this intersection across the street, and then walk a little bit more down to the hotel where we're staying at. There's probably like 30 or 40 people. I mean, it's literally, Disneyland is now closed, so, the crowds are huge. And this car pulls up and eggs the crowd. I mean, just a random group of teenagers just pull up and just start chucking eggs. Now, if that was it, that'd be enough to get your blood boiling a little bit, right? Out of all the dads, all the dudes that were in this group, none of us got hit with an egg. You know the 2 people who got hit with eggs? I mean, most of them landed on the ground and splattered, and we're like, what the heck, and all this kind of stuff. It's a little frustrating. And we start to look around, well, who got hit? My wife and my daughter. Out of a group of 30 or 40 people. How did I react? Dads, how would you react? The first thing in me was, can I catch that car, right? He's probably only going 20 miles an hour. If I really sprinted my tail off, and I've heard of the adrenaline where you get to pick up cars when you're in, dire situations and stuff, I was that mad, so I'm thinking, it could happen, right? So, I had that moment. I'm going to chase him down. I don't know what I was going to do at that point, but, open up the door, pull him out, I don't know. But that's the natural response, right? When you've been harmed, when you've been abused, when you've been mistreated. James wants us to pause and say, yeah, I get it. You get hurt in life, I know. It breaks God's heart. It should break yours, absolutely. There's pain, people do unkind things, people cheat, people steal, people hurt you. Yeah. But you got to learn to pause. Because sometimes how you respond can cause more damage than what has already occurred. Have you ever heard the phrase, hurt people hurt people? It's true, isn't it? It's cliche, but it's true. When we are hurt, when we experience pain and suffering in our lives, the natural thing to do is to react, and what almost always happens? Now someone else has gotten hurt too. We see this with kids all the time. It's one of the most saddest things about the nation that we live in today is to watch kids who have gone through various forms of abuse, various forms of mistreatment, broken families, whatever it is, right, where they are in pain now. They are suffering. And more often than not, they make decisions now where they hurt other people as a result. I'm not saying it's their fault. I mean, that's awful. But that's what happens. Hurt people hurt people. You and I hurt people when we go through pain and suffering if we don't learn to pause. If we don't learn to stop and say, you know what, how I respond to my circumstances is more important than the circumstances themselves. See, when we're not patient in the face of our own trials, our own pains, our own suffering, we usually bring upon more suffering. Not just to ourselves, but to other people as well. So what I want to do is look at a few things. If you go back to this text, this letter that James wrote, I think there's a few things in this section where James specifically says, you know what? Don't do this. Pause. It's going to need God's grace. You're going to have to pray probably. You're going to have to draw upon Him. You can't do this in your own strength, right? And you watch your wife and your daughter get egged, or you go through something much, much worse. That's little compared to the big stuff that a lot of us have gone through in life, right? How we've been mistreated by others, how we've been abused. I know that. I'm just giving you kind of a simple example. If we were to pause when those things happen and not do some of the things that are so natural for us to do, things will go so much better. So I think this is the first thing, and this is kind of the overarching thing that we've already talked about, but specifically James encourages us not to fight back. Not to fight back. It's so natural for us to want to, when we get mistreated and we get abused, to be like, you're going to get yours. I'm going to do something. I'm going to fight back. I'm going to chase that car down the freeway in Anaheim and pull those guys out of there. I'm going to do something to make this right, to get revenge, whatever. And James says, pause. You got to pause. I know you think that's right. I know that's natural, but you'll probably end up hurting yourself and others even more. Yeah, you got to put up boundaries. Yeah, you got to figure out how to protect yourself. Maybe next time I'll be carrying an umbrella. I don't know, when I go to Disneyland. Whatever. There are certain things that wise people do in life. It's not saying, James isn't saying go through life and just let people pick on you and beat up on you and keep putting yourself in the same situations where people keep hurting you on. It's not what James is saying at all. But that impulse to get revenge, that impulse to be the judge and stand in God's seat and say, you know what, I'm going to make this right. I'm going to make sure they get what's coming to them. James wants to warn us that usually doesn't work out very well. Again, you don't sit back on your hands and do nothing. That was a rough night after the egging, as it's now known in our house, right? My little girl standing there in our hotel room with tears in her face. Why would someone do that to me, Dad? Why would someone throw an egg? I don't know them. I mean, just cry, in Disneyland, happiest place on earth. So there's some work to do when we suffer, when we go through pain. There's a lot of prayer that night. There's a lot of talking to the kids, not much sleep for me and my wife. But don't fight back. Don't take justice into your own hands. Forgive and trust God to do what he needs to do in other people's lives. It's one of the things James is encouraging us not to do. I think another thing that James is saying, don't do, it's going to feel natural, but don't do it, is to let our pain make us treat others poorly. And he specifically, when he brings this up, he's talking about, he says, don't grumble with one another. In other words, with those you love, those you are in right relationship with. He's saying it's so easy for us when we experience pain and suffering in our lives to just start going at it with other people because we're hurt. And we feel insecure and we're frustrated. And all of a sudden, you're lashing out at your kids. You're lashing out at your spouse. You're lashing out at your coworkers, people that didn't cause the pain to begin with. They weren't the ones who mistreated you, but that's just what naturally happens. And James is saying, please pause and make sure you're not going to let your pain cause you to treat others poorly. Because it just gets worse when that happens. You'll cause more suffering in your own life and more suffering in the lives of others. Pause. And I think the last one, and this ties into those couple of verses right at the end there that you may feel like, wow, James, it's a little weird that you added that on the end, but I think it was very strategic, as he always is. Don't let your emotions overrun your mouths. James is big on this. If you're familiar with James chapter 3, we talked about it 3 or 4 weeks ago. James really wants us to know how important it is, even if we still got a mess inside, even if there's a storm brewing inside of you, to lean on God, to be humble, to rely on his grace and strength, and to not say words that will destroy. And he's bringing us back to that point. And he's basically saying, when you and I are experiencing pain and suffering in our lives, we're going through something that's hard and it's frustrating, and we were mistreated, we were abused, and it should have never happened. It's so easy to let our mouths do things they shouldn't do. And that whole swearing thing, he's not talking about, don't say the F word, or don't say, it's not what he's talking about. Not that I wouldn't encourage that kind of stuff either, but what James is talking about here is this idea, and it comes out of our heart. When we're hurt, when we're abused, when we're feeling insecure, where we say things like, I swear, if that ever happens again. I swear, by the name of God, I swear I will get even. I will do this. It's that mentality, that heart position where we say, you know what, I got to step in and be God here. I got to do something. And that angerness and that bitterness wells up inside of us. And we start to say things like that. And even if you never use the word I swear, it doesn't matter. That's not what James is getting at. The point is, where's your heart with this? Don't let your emotions overrun your mouth and you start being that guy, that gal that's hardened on the outside. And everything's so declarative. Everything's so, I swear, and I'm going to do this. Saying, don't let your emotions overrun your mouth. People get hurt. Suffering will just continue. Usually people who talk like that, it's flowing out of a bitterness inside. There's a frustration inside. And if you let that linger, if you let that fester, if you let that go, and then it just comes out in your words and how you say things and how you present yourself to people, it's not going to make things better. It's going to make things a lot worse. I had to, again, to go back to my silly Disneyland example, I had a good solid, I think I said in the first service, 3 months, it might have even been longer, where I wrestled with that internally. And that is the worst, when you have no recourse whatsoever, right? I mean, even if you could, if there's something you could do, right? When there's absolutely nothing you can do, you're like, I can't go find that guy, I can't talk to him, and it just bubbled into me, and I just got more frustrated, and I came to a point where I had to say, God, I gotta let go of this. And I can't, so you're gonna have to help me. God, soften my heart. God, help me to let go of it. Because I was starting to say things when I'd tell the story, and if I would have got my hands on them, or laughing with some buddies or whatever, oh man, I was telling the story to a friend of mine last week, and they said, geez, that would have just driven me crazy. And I was like, yeah, it drove me crazy. Of course, that's the natural response. But James is saying, don't go there. Pause. Be patient. Trust in God. He is the ultimate judge. In Romans chapter 12, Paul, it's a different letter, different audience, but I think really captures this whole idea of what James is getting at, probably better than any other place that I've read in the scripture. And he says this in Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Doesn't mean you can make peace happen in every situation, right? Because it takes two to tango. You can't control everyone. But as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And he goes on, he says, do not take revenge. This is exactly what James is talking about. My dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. Don't think that if someone does something wrong, if someone mistreats you, if someone is hurting people, that they're ultimately ever getting away with it. They're not. God sees. And God loves all of us enough, especially guys that run around cars and throw eggs at people, to deal with them with their stuff when he needs to. You and I don't have to be the judge. You and I don't have to go make it right. You and I don't have to be the ones to set everything straight and make sure people get what's coming to them. If God needs to do something, he can do it. We need to say, I need to pause. I need to let God be the judge. Not saying it's right. It's not turning a blind eye to sin. Not at all. We talked with our kids very openly that night. That was wrong. You should never have to experience that. They made the wrong choice, and they will suffer for it as a result, kids. If you decide to do things like that in your life where you have no regard for other people and their feelings and their physical safety and all those sorts of things, if you make those types of choices, you will suffer for it as a result. No one gets away with anything on this earth, ultimately. But God is the judge. And then he sums it up. I just skip a couple of verses just for sake of time, but he sums it up in verse 21 with this. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You want two verses to live by, just to get through your daily life, right? Just to take James' admonition seriously, to pause when you're mistreated. It's these two. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone and do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. If you and I could memorize those verses, if you and I could hide those verses in our minds and our hearts and walk throughout our days. Again, doesn't mean you don't put up boundaries where you need boundaries. Doesn't mean you don't do everything you can to protect your family, to protect yourself, to make sure people don't walk all over you and do mean things to you. It's not at all what it's saying. But that we would say, you know what? God's the judge. I need to pause and make sure I'm not going to do something that's going to cause more damage, more harm, more suffering as a result. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Jesus, thank you so much for your word. God, as always, I'm just grateful that you love us enough to tell us the truth and tell us how life works best. And God, I just pray, because I know there's a lot of suffering out there. There's a lot of people experiencing mistreatment. And Father, I pray you'd give us the courage and you'd give us the strength and you'd give us the grace to respond to our suffering in a way that brings you honor, in a way that doesn't cause more suffering to come upon us, and ultimately, God, in a way that shines your light to others. But God, we can't do that on our own. I know there's some tough situations in a church like this, maybe not even from mistreatment from others, but just from the realities of life and the challenges of life and the things that happen outside of our control. God, there's so much that can bring us pain. Father, I pray that you would help us to respond with light, to respond with life, to respond with love. But God, again, we need your help to do that. So I don't know what everyone's facing here this morning. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff. Speak into every heart. Help us know how to take James' words here and live them out this week in our life, where we live with what we're going through. And God, may we all take a step closer to you as a result. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, great to be with you. We'll see you next Sunday.